The thing nobody tells you about Christmas morning is how loud a house can feel when it's full of quiet, because the furnace clicks on, the tree lights hum, the neighbor's inflatable Santa wheezes like it's dying, and you're standing in your kitchen in an old Packers hoodie, pretending the smell of cinnamon rolls is the smell of a life that still belongs to you, while your wife's phone lights up on the counter for the third time with the same name and the same little heart emoji that is absolutely not mine, and I'm trying to convince myself that I'm not the kind of man who reads his wife's notifications like they're evidence at a trial, even as my hands start shaking hard enough that I nearly drop the coffee mug I got from my union steward when I made foreman, because the message preview flashes a sentence that is too intimate to be innocent and too confident to be a mistake. And the worst part is that it's Christmas Day, which means I'm supposed to be grateful and warm and forgiving, and instead I'm doing that sick mental math where you realize that every weird vibe, every "I'm just tired," every night she rolled away from me like I'd suddenly grown thorns, has been adding up quietly to this exact moment, with the tree glowing in the corner like a witness that can't testify. I'm 38. I live in a little Milwaukee suburb where the sidewalks get salted like religion, and I work as a refrigeration tech for a grocery distribution company, which means I'm the guy who gets called at midnight when somebody's freezer starts screaming and I'm supposed to fix it without making a scene, and for most of my marriage I've been proud that I can keep my head down, keep my hands steady, keep the chaos contained, because my wife, Hannah, used to love that about me, and she used to say that I made her feel safe in a world that always felt like it was slipping, and I believed her because we built a whole routine around it, with pancakes on Sundays, bad reality TV on weeknights, and a shared calendar that used to be full of dumb little jokes and reminders like, "Kiss husband or he turns into a gremlin." Except the calendar had gone quiet over the last 6 months in a way I couldn't name without sounding dramatic, and she had started acting like my presence was background noise instead of a person, which is a specific kind of loneliness that makes you question your own reality, because nothing technically happens, there's no big fight, there's no obvious betrayal, there's just a slow erosion where she guards her phone like it's a secret organ, and she starts taking evening walks that never used to happen, and she suddenly cares about wearing perfume to go pick up a gift bag at Target, and when you ask what's changed, she looks at you like you're accusing her of murder and says you are being paranoid and exhausting, which is a clever way to make you feel guilty for noticing that your own marriage is bleeding out quietly in the corner. We moved into this neighborhood 3 years ago because we wanted a calmer life, which is a hilarious phrase in hindsight because the neighborhood is basically an aquarium of other people's lives, with everyone watching and waving and measuring, and right next door is this guy named Derek who always acted like he was running for mayor of the cul-de-sac, always grinning, always offering to help carry mulch, always finding reasons to linger. And at first I thought he was just one of those guys who can't stand silence, but then I started noticing how Hannah's face changed when he was around, the way she laughed too hard at things that weren't funny, the way she touched her hair like she had a nervous tic, and the way Derek looked at her like he was tasting something, and I told myself I was reading into it because I didn't want to be the suspicious husband archetype, I didn't want to be the guy who sees cheating in every shadow, especially because we had gone through a rough patch where my overtime got insane and I was coming home smelling like compressor oil and stress, and I kept thinking that if I could just get through the busy season, if I could just give her one normal month, she would come back to me the way she used to, like love was a switch you could flip back on if you just worked hard enough and didn't complain. Christmas Eve had been tense in that we're both pretending we're fine way, where you wrap presents beside each other and the silence feels like a third person sitting between you, and Hannah kept disappearing to the bathroom with her phone, and she kept smiling at it in this small private way that made my stomach twist, because she hasn't smiled like that at me in months, and by the time we went to bed she said she had a headache and rolled away from me, leaving this cold strip of sheet between us that felt like a border, and I stared at the ceiling listening to her breathe and trying not to imagine things I didn't have proof of, because proof is the line between fear and reality, except on Christmas morning the proof basically walked into my kitchen and lit itself up, because her phone was charging on the counter and I was moving around trying to be cheerful, trying to make coffee and put on music, and then it buzzed, and the screen flashed Derek Blueheart with a message preview that read, "I can still taste you and I swear I'm going to lose my mind if I have to pretend in front of him today," and my vision tunneled so fast that it felt like my body was trying to evacuate my soul, because there are some sentences that cannot be misunderstood no matter how hard you try, and I stood there for a long time with the coffee maker sputtering like it was mocking me, telling myself I should do the noble thing and wake her up and have an honest talk, telling myself I should respect privacy, telling myself I should not touch her phone, while my hands moved anyway like they belonged to somebody else, because at some point dignity becomes a luxury you can't afford. I know people love to argue about snooping and boundaries like it's a philosophy debate, but I promise you that when your world is collapsing and you can feel it in your bones, the only boundary you care about is the one between truth and whatever lie you've been living in. And I unlocked her phone because I knew her passcode, because of course I did, because we're married and we used to be the kind of couple who didn't have secrets like that. And I went straight into the messages and found a whole thread of them, months of them, with photos that were careful enough not to show faces but intimate enough to make my throat close, with plans for walks and errands, and quick hellos that were really meetings in his garage, with Derek writing things like he owned her, like he was entitled to her, and Hannah responding in this breathless tone I hadn't heard from her in years. And the timestamp details made it worse because it proved that while I was working overtime to keep our bills paid, she was using my absence as cover to build a second relationship right next to me, in full view of the same windows we hang lights in. And then I saw the message from last night where she wrote, "Tomorrow's going to be hard but I'll find a way, I need you," and he wrote back, "I'll be waiting, like always," and something inside me went cold and very calm in a way that scared me, because the shock burned off and underneath it was this steady, terrifying clarity that my marriage was not struggling, my marriage was being actively betrayed, and the betrayal lived 10 feet away behind a white vinyl fence. Hannah came downstairs like a scene from a different movie, hair messy, wearing the flannel pajama pants I bought her last year, yawning and smiling like this was going to be a normal holiday, and she kissed my cheek in that distracted way that used to hurt my feelings but now felt like an insult, and she said, "You're up early, you didn't have to do all this," and I watched her eyes flick to the phone on the counter like a reflex, and I heard my own voice come out steady and low even though my chest felt like it was full of broken glass, because I said, "You should probably read what Derek wrote you, because it seems like he's having trouble pretending in front of me today," and the way her face changed was immediate and violent, like I had slapped her with words, because her skin went pale and her mouth opened and closed without sound for a second, and then she tried to reach for the phone like she could snatch the truth back into hiding, and I stepped between her and the counter. Without raising my voice, which somehow made it worse, because quiet anger is a warning sign, and she whispered my name like she was begging me not to say it out loud, and I didn't give her that mercy, because I said, "I read it, Hannah, and I read the rest of it, and I need you to look me in the eyes and tell me you didn't sleep with him, because if you lie right now I swear I will never forget your face," and she started shaking. And she tried to do that thing where she makes it about my behavior instead of hers, because she said, "Why would you go through my phone, what is wrong with you, that is such a violation," and I laughed in this ugly way that scared even me, because I said, "You are standing in my kitchen on Christmas Day after months of having sex with our neighbor and you want to talk to me about violations like you're the injured party, so pick a different strategy because that one makes you sound insane." The conversation didn't stay neat, because real confrontations don't, and she started crying in loud panicked waves while still trying to control the narrative, and she told me I had been distant, and she told me I worked too much, and she told me she felt lonely and unseen, and every word sounded rehearsed, like she had been practicing excuses in her head in case this day ever came. And I let her talk long enough to prove to myself that she was not sorry about the betrayal, she was sorry about being caught, because even while she cried she kept trying to angle her body toward the door like she was thinking of running, and when I said, "Was it worth it, was he worth watching me turn into a ghost in my own house," she snapped and said, "You're acting like I did this to hurt you, and it wasn't about you," and I felt something rupture behind my ribs because that is the most cruel thing someone can say. That your pain is just collateral damage in their personal journey, and I leaned closer and said, "It became about me the first time you chose him over me, and it became about me every time you came home and let me touch you like I wasn't sharing you with someone else," and she started saying Derek understood her, and Derek listened, and Derek made her feel alive, and she said it with this desperate intensity like she wanted me to accept it as a legitimate explanation, and I asked, "So how long, Hannah? Because I deserve the truth even if it kills me," and she hesitated just long enough to confirm everything, and then she whispered, "Since September, which meant she had been lying through our anniversary, lying through Thanksgiving, lying while we picked out ornaments, lying while she sat across from my mother at dinner and smiled like she wasn't detonating my life. I demanded to know where and when and how, not because I wanted the imagery, but because I needed to understand how bold the betrayal was, and she confessed in pieces, like ripping off bandages slowly, and she admitted it was in his garage, at first, and then it was in his house when his wife took their kids to her sister's, and then it was in our house twice while I was on call. And that last detail made me see red in a way that felt almost primal, because she had brought him into the bed I sleep in, and I told her, "You made our home a place I will never feel safe again," and she screamed back that I was being dramatic, and then she tried to bargain, because she said she was confused and it just happened, and she could end it, and she reached for my arm with wet hands like she could pull me back into believing her, and I shook her off and said, "Do not touch me like you still get that privilege." And she collapsed into a chair and started sobbing harder, and she kept saying she loved me, which felt like an insult because love without respect is just possession wearing a mask, and when I told her I wanted her to pack a bag and leave, she looked up with this sudden hard anger and said, "You can't kick me out on Christmas, what kind of man does that?" And I stared at her and said, "The kind of man who finally understands that his kindness has been used as a tool against him." She tried calling Derek right then, right in front of me, like she couldn't help herself, like he was a drug, and when his voicemail picked up she started whispering into the phone with frantic urgency, and I heard enough to know she was trying to coordinate a story, and I felt this cold clarity settle deeper, because I realized that if I reacted like a wounded animal, if I threw things or shouted until my throat bled, I would just hand her the ability to paint me as unstable and cruel, and I wasn't going to lose my future because she lost her morals, so I said, very calmly, "You can call whoever you want, but you are going to listen to me now, because I am done being the only adult in this marriage," and she looked at me with fear mixed with resentment, and I said, "You are going to pack what you need for a few nights, you are going to leave this house without making a scene, and you are going to understand that from this moment forward I am documenting everything, every message, every admission, every choice, and I am not going to protect you from consequences anymore," and she started to protest and say she didn't mean it and she was sorry and she wanted counseling, and I said, "You did not ask for counseling when you were sneaking into our neighbor's garage, so do not suddenly become a marriage advocate now that you are scared," and the most terrifying part is that as I said those words, I could feel the beginning of a plan forming in my head, not a violent plan, not a movie villain plan, but a precise, patient plan built out of the same skills I use at work when a system is failing and nobody else wants to admit it, because if you want to fix a disaster, you don't scream at the leak, you isolate it, you document it, and you make sure the person who caused it cannot blame you for the flooding. By the time Hannah finally went upstairs to start throwing clothes into a bag with trembling hands, the house felt like it was holding its breath, and I stood alone by the window looking out at the snow and Derek's porch light glowing smugly through the frost, and I realized I wasn't just angry at them, I was angry at the version of me who kept accepting crumbs and calling it love, and I promised myself, right there on Christmas Day with the tree still lit and my coffee gone cold, that I was going to handle this in a way that left me standing at the end, because if they wanted to treat me like a fool living next door to my own humiliation, then I was going to show them what it looks like when the fool stops playing along and starts writing the ending himself. People always imagine the pain hits like a punch and then you either break or you don't, but what actually happened to me over the next days was more like being dragged behind a truck on ice, because everything felt slippery and sharp and relentless, and even when I was alone I could hear Hannah's words echoing, especially that poisonous line about how it wasn't about me, which made me feel like I had been erased from my own marriage. And I kept oscillating between nausea and fury and this hollow sadness that would sneak up on me at random, like when I found her favorite mug in the dishwasher or saw her hair tie on the bathroom sink, because the most humiliating part of betrayal is how ordinary the evidence looks, how the little domestic objects become landmines, and I slept maybe 2 hours at a time, waking up with my heart racing like I'd been running, and I would sit on the edge of the bed staring at the wall, imagining Derek's hands on my wife, imagining her choosing to laugh with him while I was sweating in a freezer aisle at 2 in the morning, and every time the thoughts got too graphic I felt this sudden hot shame, because I did not want to be the man who obsessively pictures his wife with someone else, but my brain kept returning to it like it was trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution except, she wanted to, and that truth is the one that breaks you, because you can explain mistakes. You can even explain weakness, but explaining desire is impossible. When you're the one who wasn't desired enough. The morning after, when the neighborhood started waking up and kids were sledding like nothing happened, I found myself standing at the sink shaking so badly I had to grip the counter, and I had a moment where I understood why people do reckless things when they get cheated on, because rage feels like power and power feels like relief. And I wanted to march next door and pound on Derek's door until the whole street watched him answer and saw what he was, and I wanted to scream his name so his wife would come running, and I wanted to watch Hannah flinch under the weight of public shame, because there is a part of you that wants your pain to be visible to others so you don't feel crazy carrying it alone, but then a different part of me, the part that has fixed systems for a living and knows how quickly mistakes become permanent, told me that impulse is exactly how you lose control of your own story. And I needed control more than I needed catharsis, because I had started to see the shape of the battlefield, and it wasn't just emotional, it was legal, financial, social, and the winner would be the person who stayed steady while the other two spiraled. I called my older brother, Mark, who is the kind of man who can sound calm while his eyes are on fire, and I told him everything in one long breath like if I stopped talking I would collapse, and he didn't interrupt me with clichés, he didn't tell me to be the bigger person, he just said, you are going to protect yourself first, and then you are going to let consequences do what consequences do. And that sentence became my anchor, because I realized the best revenge was not humiliation or screaming or a dramatic confrontation that makes for a good story but a bad future. The best revenge was building a life Hannah could not access anymore while making sure the truth was undeniable, so I started with evidence, because evidence is oxygen when someone tries to rewrite reality, and I backed up the messages I had already seen. I wrote down dates and times she admitted. I saved the phone records that showed Derek's number popping up on her walk nights, and I went to a divorce attorney on December 26th, sitting in a waiting room that still had a plastic wreath on the door, feeling like I was visiting a funeral home for my own marriage, and the attorney, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice like a seatbelt click, told me that the worst thing I could do was move emotionally before I moved strategically, because she'd seen too many spouses get baited into mistakes. And she laid out a plan that was boring and devastating, which was exactly what I needed, because boring means controlled, and controlled means survivable. Then I executed the part that people will call petty, and maybe it was, but it was also clean, legal, and honest, because the truth is not petty, the truth is just inconvenient for liars, and I sent a message to Derek's wife, Kendra, asking if we could talk privately, and when she responded with confusion and a slightly annoyed tone like she thought I was asking about property lines, I told her, in one long paragraph, that I had proof her husband and my wife had been having an affair since September, and I offered to share whatever she needed because she deserved the truth, and within minutes she called me, and the sound she made when she started crying was the sound of a person realizing their life has been compromised, and I hated that I was the one delivering it, but I also felt a grim sense of honor, because if I was going to burn, I was not going to be the only one standing in smoke while Derek got to keep pretending he was a friendly neighbor with good holiday decorations. And Kendra asked me questions in a shaking voice that never stabilized, and I answered honestly without embellishment, and I sent her screenshots with dates, and then she got quiet in a way that scared me, and she said, very slowly, I am going to handle this, which was the most terrifying promise I had heard all week because it meant Derek's consequences were about to become real. Hannah, meanwhile, tried to pivot into damage control like a politician caught in a scandal, and she started texting me long emotional essays about how she lost herself, and how she made a mistake, and how she wanted to come home, and she sprinkled in memories like bait, like the trip we took to Door County, like the time we danced in the kitchen to some stupid pop song, like those were coupons she could redeem for forgiveness. And when I didn't respond the tone shifted, because remorse without control quickly turns into anger, and she started accusing me of being cold and cruel, and she said I was punishing her, and she even implied that if I had been a better husband she wouldn't have needed Derek, and that was the moment I felt the last thread of tenderness snap, because a person who blames you for their betrayal is not someone you can rebuild with. So I stopped engaging emotionally and started communicating like a business transaction, and I told her she could contact me through email only, and that any conversation would be about logistics, and I watched her spiral as she realized tears weren't working, rage wasn't working, nostalgia wasn't working, because the one thing she couldn't manipulate was my silence. The revenge plan, if you want to call it that, wasn't one grand dramatic act, it was a sequence of small doors closing in her face while larger doors opened for me, because while she was bouncing between Derek's house and her sister's couch, I was meeting with my attorney, tightening my finances, changing passwords, documenting everything, and telling the truth to the people who mattered before she could poison the narrative, including my parents and her parents, and I did it without theatrics, because I told them, Hannah has been having an affair with Derek next door since September, I have proof, and I am filing for divorce, and watching her mother's face collapse into furious disappointment was not satisfying in a joyful way, it was satisfying in a justice way, because truth finally had witnesses, and Hannah could no longer pretend this was a rough patch, caused by my overtime. And once the truth entered the family system, it spread like dye in water. Derek's downfall came faster than I expected, because Kendra didn't do what people in movies do where they scream and throw a lamp and then quietly accept betrayal, she did what real furious betrayed spouses do when they have self-respect and legal advice, which is that she contacted an attorney, she froze accounts, she documented everything, and she confronted Derek at a time when he thought he could charm his way out of it. And according to what the neighborhood later whispered, Derek tried the same manipulative script Hannah tried, telling Kendra it wasn't serious, and that she was overreacting, and then Kendra went nuclear in the most controlled way, because she filed first, she demanded custody terms, she told their families, and she kicked him out, and suddenly the man who had been strutting around the cul-de-sac like a golden retriever with a mortgage was sleeping in a cheap extended-stay motel by the highway, and the neighborhood, which had always felt like an aquarium, turned into a courtroom, because people stopped waving at him, people stopped accepting his help, and the same guys who used to drink beers with him in summer suddenly found reasons to go inside when he approached, and I didn't have to orchestrate any of that, because communities have their own immune systems, and cheaters are a kind of infection everyone is afraid to catch. My divorce finalized months later, and the day I signed the last document I expected to feel triumphant, like I had won, but what I actually felt was grief mixed with relief, because winning isn't the right word when you lose a marriage, even when the marriage was already being hollowed out by someone else. And I went home afterward and sat in my living room with no decorations up and no second toothbrush in the bathroom, and I let myself feel the sadness fully, not because I missed Hannah as she was in the end, but because I missed the version of my life that I believed in, and then, slowly, the heaviness started to lift, because I realized I could breathe in my own home again, I could sleep without waiting for the buzz of her phone, I could stop monitoring tiny changes in her tone like they were weather warnings, and over time I rebuilt myself in small honest ways, like getting back into lifting, like taking weekend drives up to Lake Michigan with podcasts on, like learning to cook things that weren't just husband survival meals, and eventually, when I wasn't bleeding anymore, I met someone through a friend's game night, a woman named Elise who asked direct questions and laughed with her whole face, and who treated honesty like it was normal instead of negotiable, and being with her felt strange at first because I realized I had been living on emotional eggshells for so long that kindness felt suspicious. But kindness that stays consistent eventually retrains your nervous system, and that's what happened to me, slowly and steadily, until one day I realized I was happy without needing to prove anything to the people who hurt me. Hannah's life, on the other hand, did exactly what happens when someone builds their identity on a secret they can't defend once it's exposed, because she lost Derek the moment he became inconvenient, and Derek, who had promised her excitement and escape, couldn't even keep his own life intact, and once Kendra filed and the neighborhood turned on him, he turned on Hannah too, blaming her like she was the reason his marriage imploded, which is what cowards do when consequences arrive, and Hannah tried crawling back to me when she realized the fantasy was over, but there is a particular kind of peace that comes from realizing you do not owe your betrayer a second chance, and I didn't take her back, and she couldn't handle the combination of family disappointment, social fallout, financial instability, and the dawning realization that the new life she chased was just a cheap thrill that cost her everything real. So she bounced between jobs and apartments and explanations that never sounded convincing, and every time she tried to rewrite the story, someone would quietly remind her that the truth already had receipts, and I didn't celebrate her downfall like it was entertainment, but I also didn't rescue her from it, because rescuing her would have meant rescuing her from accountability, and accountability was the one gift she had refused to give me when she chose betrayal. If there's any advice I can offer from the wreckage, it's this, and I say it with all the hard-earned honor I can muster, because I know how tempting it is to want loud revenge when your heart is on fire, but loud revenge burns you too, while quiet, strategic truth lets you walk away intact. So document what you know, protect your future like it's sacred, tell the truth to the right people before the liar controls the narrative, and do not confuse compassion with self-destruction, because the happiest ever after isn't a villain getting punished, it's you waking up one ordinary morning and realizing your life belongs to you again, and the air tastes clean, and the silence in your kitchen finally feels like peace instead of dread.